That moment changed everything. What happens when a quiet life suddenly collides with forbidden emotions and a betrayal you never saw coming? Would you fight to rebuild what's broken, or would the truth shatter everything beyond repair? Before we dive into this gripping story of love, temptation, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Let's uncover this unforgettable tale together. The door creaked open under my hesitant touch, revealing the dimly lit room where my uncle lay sleeping. The sight of him, peaceful and vulnerable, struck me like an unexpected wave. He was sprawled across the bed, his dark hair a disheveled mess against the pillow and his face calm in a way I hadn't seen before. Something about the intimacy of the moment, of catching him so unguarded, unsettled me. He didn't want to be uncomfortable, so he was properly treated and his face softened. I hadn't intended to walk in unannounced, but the house was so quiet that my footsteps felt like thunder against the hardwood floor. I had knocked, but there was no answer. He always left his door slightly ajar, a small quirk that made me feel welcome, even in his most private space. "Uncle Ben?" I whispered, stepping closer, though the sound of my voice felt out of place. The late afternoon light filtering through the blinds cast striped shadows on the walls. I could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, the rhythm of his breathing almost hypnotic. He stirred, his lashes fluttering as his eyes opened slowly. There was a split second of confusion before his gaze settled on me, and his lips curled into a faint smile. "Lila," he said, his voice groggy but warm, "what are you doing in here?" I knocked, but you didn't answer," I stammered, feeling a flush rise to my cheeks. "I just wanted to check on you." Ben chuckled softly, his hand running through his hair as he pushed himself up against the headboard. "I must have dozed off. It's been a long day." I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. The moment felt too intimate, too charged in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." He waved his hand dismissively. "You're fine. Sit down." I perched awkwardly on the edge of the bed, smoothing my skirt nervously. Ben and I had always been close. Growing up, he was the cool uncle, the one who'd sneak me chocolate before dinner or take me on spontaneous adventures when my parents weren't looking. But since moving in with him and my husband temporarily while our house was being renovated, I had started noticing things about him I'd never seen before. The way his laugh lingered in a room, the way he could command attention without even trying. "How are things going?" he asked, pulling me from my thought. I glanced down at my hands, twisting my wedding ring absent-mindedly. "Fine, I guess. Adam's been busy with work." "That's good, right?" he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Keeps him out of trouble." I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure, it's just lonely sometimes." Ben's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. You know you can talk to me, right?" There was something in his voice, a quiet sincerity that made my chest tighten. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I know." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. I could feel his gaze on me, studying me in a way that made me both uncomfortable and inexplicably drawn to him. "You deserve to be happy, Lila," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." The words hit harder than they should have, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I blinked them away quickly, laughing nervously to cover the emotion. "You sound like a self-help book." Ben grinned, the tension breaking. "Maybe I've read a few." I shook my head, a genuine smile tugging at my lips. "Thanks, Uncle Ben. I mean it." "Anytime," he said, his eyes locking with mine for a beat too long. The air between us shifted again, charged with something I couldn't name but felt deep in my gut. Brushing my hands against my skirt, I should let you rest. My heart. He watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable. All right, but Lila? I paused at the door, turning to look at him. Yeah? If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me. There was a weight to his words, a promise that lingered in the air long after I left the room. As I walked down the hall, my heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreversibly between us. That night, as I sat in the living room with my laptop open, my mind kept drifting back to the conversation with Uncle Ben. I couldn't focus on the article I was supposed to be editing for work, nor could I push away the gnawing sense of unease that clung to me. My husband, Adam, was working late again. His absence was no longer surprising, it was routine. He had become a ghost in our marriage, present in name but absent in every other way. The faint hum of the television played in the background, though I couldn't recall what show was on. My thoughts wandered to the little things I had begun to notice about Ben in the few weeks we'd been living here. The way his voice had a calming cadence, the way he seemed to listen, not just hear but truly listen to everything I said. It was a stark contrast to Adam, whose responses had become increasingly perfunctory, as if I were just another item on his endless to-do list. The front door creaked open, startling me out of my thoughts. Adam stepped inside, looking exhausted and distracted. He didn't even glance in my direction before dropping his briefcase near the door and loosening his tie. Hey, I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. Long day? Yeah, he muttered, his eyes glued to his phone as he typed something rapidly. Meetings, back to back. You? No. I closed my laptop and set it aside. The usual. Worked on a few projects, ran some errands. It's good, he said absently, his focus still on the screen. After a moment he looked up, almost surprised to see me sitting there. Oh, did you eat already? Not yet. I thought we could have dinner together, I said, hopeful. He hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall. I grabbed something on the way home. I didn't think you'd wait. Of course he didn't. Why would he? I swallowed my disappointment and mustered a weak smile. No problem. I'll fix something for myself. He nodded, already turning toward the bedroom. I'm going to take a shower. Maybe we can watch something later. But we both knew that wasn't going to happen. He'd fall asleep within minutes of hitting the bed, leaving me alone with the TV and my thoughts. Again. As he disappeared down the hallway, I sighed and headed to the kitchen to make a simple salad. The house felt too quiet, the silence pressing down on me. I couldn't help but think of Uncle Ben again. Since moving in, I'd often find myself gravitating toward him, drawn to his easy demeanor and the way he seemed to notice the small things. He would ask about my day, listen with genuine interest, and crack jokes that made me laugh in a way I hadn't in months. It was dangerous, the way he made me feel seen. The next morning, Adam left early for work, barely mumbling a goodbye before heading out the door. I stood by the window, watching his car pull out of the driveway. The knot in my chest tightened as I thought about how far we'd drifted from the people we used to be. A soft knock on the kitchen door startled me. I turned to see Ben leaning against the doorframe, a cup of coffee in his hand and a knowing smile on his lips. Morning, he said, his voice warm and inviting. Morning, I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, he said, stepping into the kitchen. What about you? You seem a little preoccupied. I shrugged, not ready to dive into the emotional abyss. Just thinking. About, he pressed gently, taking a seat at the kitchen table. I hesitated, swirling the coffee in my cup as I leaned against the counter. Adam, I admitted finally, It feels like we're just going through the motions lately, like we're roommates instead of, you know. Ben studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. That's tough, he said finally. You deserve more than that, Lila. I looked away, his words hitting too close to home. It's not that simple. We not. Because, I said, frustration creeping into my tone, we've been together for years. We've built a life. You don't just walk away from that. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. No, you don't. But you also don't stay in something that makes you miserable. I'm not miserable, I said quickly, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Ben leaned back in his chair, his eyes piercing. If you say so. We fell into a contemplative silence, the only sound the faint clink of his coffee cup against the table. I felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see every crack in my carefully constructed facade. And maybe he could. You know, he said after a while, I've seen the way Adam looks at you. Or rather, the way he doesn't. He doesn't appreciate what he has. Ben, don't, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. I'm just saying, you deserve someone who sees you, really sees you, someone who makes you feel alive. I couldn't respond. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. My pulse quickened, and I felt the telltale warmth of a blush creeping up my neck. I hated how much his words affected me, how they echoed the thoughts I'd been trying to bury. Ben stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He placed his empty cup in the sink and turned to me with a small, almost sad smile. If you ever need to talk, I'm here, he said, his voice low and sincere. Don't forget that. I nodded, unable to find my voice. As he left the kitchen, I stood there, clutching my coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. The lines between us were blurring and I didn't know how to stop it, or if I even wanted to. The days that followed seemed to blur together, yet my moments with Ben became more distinct. They stood out like vivid brushstrokes against the gray canvas of my life with Adam. My husband's absence continued to be the constant backdrop. Work trips, late nights, and his growing distance left me feeling more alone than ever. It was Ben who filled the void, sometimes without even meaning to. It started small. Casual conversations over coffee turned into deeper exchanges. A walk through the garden one afternoon became a moment of shared vulnerability. He'd confessed that he'd been lonely too, that living alone for so long had made him miss the connection he once had with people. I guess I've just gotten used to my own company, he'd said, his voice tinged with melancholy. I know the feeling, I admitted, surprising even myself with the honesty. Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible in my own marriage. Ben had stopped walking then, turning to face me. His gaze was intense, his eyes searching mine as if trying to unravel the knots of my heart. You're not invisible, Lila. Not to me. Those words lingered with me long after the moment passed. They became an anchor, something I clung to during the endless hours I spent waiting for Adam to come home or for him to notice me. One evening, the house was particularly quiet. Adam had left for a work trip that morning, and Ben had offered to cook dinner. I wasn't sure if it was the wine we drank or the warmth of the candlelight that made everything feel more intimate, but by the time we finished eating, the air between us was electric. You've got a bit of sauce, Ben said, gesturing to the corner of his mouth. His voice was teasing, but there was an undertone of something else, something heavier. Where? I asked, instinctively wiping at my face. No, not there, he said with a smirk. Here. He reached across the table, his thumb brushing the corner of my lips. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, leaving me breathless. Thanks, I said, my voice shaky. He leaned back, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You don't have to thank me, he said softly. It's just, you deserve someone who notices these things, someone who pays attention. I looked away, my heart pounding. Ben, we can't? I know, he interrupted, his tone resigned, but still laced with longing. I know we can't, but that doesn't change how I feel. I froze, my mind racing. He'd crossed the line and we both knew it. But instead of addressing it, I stood abruptly, gathering the plates from the table. I should clean up. Lila, wait, he said, standing too. His hand closed around my wrist, gentle but firm. I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable. That was never my intention. You didn't, I whispered, though the words felt like a lie. I wasn't uncomfortable. I was scared. Scared of how much I wanted him to hold on to me, to bridge the gap between us that felt impossibly wide yet dangerously thin. He let go, stepping back to give me space. I'll leave you to it, he said quietly, retreating to his room. I stared after him, torn between relief and regret. The boundaries between us were blurring faster than I could redraw them, and part of me wasn't sure I wanted to. The tension between us only grew after that night. Every shared glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark ready to ignite a flame. And then, one afternoon, it did. It was raining, the kind of downpour that made you want to curl up inside and listen to the steady rhythm against the windows. I was in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when Ben appeared, his shirt damp and clinging to his frame. Got caught in the rain, he said, shaking droplets from his hair. Clearly, I said, laughing despite myself. Why didn't you use an umbrella? Didn't have one, he replied with a grin. But I don't mind. It's refreshing. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. My laughter faded, replaced by a charged silence. I could feel the tension crackling between us, like the storm outside had found its way into the room. You've got rain on your face, I said, trying to break the moment. I reached out to brush it away, but as soon as my fingers touched his skin, the world seemed to stop. His hand covered mine, holding it in place as he looked at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. Lila, he murmured, his voice low and rough. I should have pulled away. I should have said something to stop this from going any further, but I didn't. I couldn't. My breath hitched as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in the gentlest of kisses. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the waters, but when I didn't pull away, he deepened it, his hands sliding up to cradle my face. I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his damp hair as the kiss grew more urgent, more desperate. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, reality came crashing down. We shouldn't have done that, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know, he said, his forehead resting against mine, but I don't regret it. I didn't respond because I wasn't sure if I regretted it either. All I knew was that something had changed between us, something we couldn't undo, and as much as I hated myself for it, I didn't want to. The guilt from that kiss lingered long after it ended. I tried to throw myself into distractions, work, cleaning, even calling old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. But nothing could erase the memory of Ben's lips on mine, the way his hands had felt against my skin. Worse, I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. Ben and I avoided each other for the next few days. Whenever we were in the same room, the air was heavy with unspoken words and stolen glances. Even Adam, oblivious as he was, seemed to notice the tension. One evening, Adam came home earlier than usual. He dropped his briefcase by the door, his tie loosened, and his face drawn with exhaustion. Hey, he said, giving me a peck on the cheek. Everything okay? Yeah, I said quickly, hoping my voice didn't betray me. Just Tired. Long day. He nodded, heading into the kitchen to grab a beer. Been around? He asked over his shoulder. My heart skipped a beat. I think he's in his room, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Adam didn't press further, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I hated lying to him, but what could I say? That his wife was harboring feelings for his uncle? That the man he trusted had crossed a line neither of us could uncross? The next day, the tension finally reached its breaking point. It started innocently enough. Ben and I were in the kitchen together, avoiding eye contact as we moved around each other. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee while I loaded the dishwasher. The silence was unbearable. Lila, he said suddenly, his voice soft but firm. We need to talk. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. There's nothing to talk about, I said, not turning to face him. We made a mistake. It won't happen again. It's not that simple, he said, stepping closer. I could feel his presence behind me, the warmth of him making my skin prickle. I can't stop thinking about you, about us. Ben, please, I whispered, my voice trembling. Adam's right upstairs. I know, he said, his voice laced with frustration, but I can't pretend this doesn't exist. Can you? I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling under the intensity of his gaze. We can't do this, I said, though the words felt hollow. It's wrong. Is it? He challenged, his eyes locking onto mine, because it feels more right than anything I've felt in years. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. We both turned toward the doorway just as Adam appeared, a confused expression on his face. What's going on? He asked, his eyes darting between us. Nothing, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Ben was just helping me with the dishwasher. Adam frowned, his gaze lingering on us a moment too long. Okay, he said slowly, but his tone suggested he didn't quite believe me. As the day went on, Adam's suspicion grew. He started watching me more closely, his questions becoming sharper, more pointed. You've been acting strange lately, he said that evening as we sat on the couch. Is there something you're not telling me? No, I said, shaking my head. Of course not. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as if he was holding back from saying more. 2 nights later, the unthinkable happened. Adam had gone to bed early, exhausted from another long day at work. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when Ben walked in. He looked hesitant, as if he wasn't sure whether he should say anything. We can't keep avoiding each other, he said finally, his voice low. I know, I said, sighing. But I don't know how to fix this. Ben stepped closer, his expression softening. Maybe it's not something we can fix, he said. Maybe we're not supposed to. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, his hand brushed mine. It was a small gesture, barely a touch, but it sent a ripple through me. Before I knew what was happening, he was kissing me again, his lips capturing mine with a hunger that left me breathless. This time, I didn't pull away. The sound of something shattering made us break apart abruptly. My heart plummeted as I turned to see Adam standing in the doorway, a broken glass at his feet. His face was a mask of shock and betrayal, his eyes locked on us like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I stared at him in frustration, his eyes locked on us like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Adam, I started, stepping toward him, but he held up a hand to stop me.
Don't, he said, his voice low and trembling. Don't you dare. Let me explain, I pleaded, panic rising in my chest. It's not what it looks like.
He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Not what it looks like? Really, Lila? Because it looks like you were kissing my uncle in our kitchen. Ben stepped forward then, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Adam, listen. Don't, Adam snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. Don't you say a word. The silence that followed was deafening. Adam's eyes burned with anger and hurt, and I could feel the weight of his betrayal pressing down on me. I trusted you, he said finally, his voice breaking. Both of you. Adam, please, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I never meant for this to happen. Save it, he said, his voice cold. Just save it. He turned and walked out, slamming the front door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving me standing there in the wreckage of what had just happened. Ben reached for me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. This is a disaster, I said, my voice shaking. What have we done? Adam didn't come home that night. I spent hours pacing the living room, my mind racing with every possible scenario. My phone sat untouched on the coffee table, its screen dark. I wanted to call him, to beg him to come back, to plead for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What could I even say? There was no excuse for what he'd seen. Ben sat silently in his room, the door shut. I could feel his presence on the other side of the wall, and it made the air in the house feel suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft rustle of the curtains was a reminder of the mess we'd created. I wanted to blame him, to tell myself he was the one who had crossed the line first, but deep down I knew I was just as responsible. By morning I was emotionally drained, my eyes swollen from crying. I heard Ben's door open, his footsteps hesitant as he walked into the living room. He looked as tired as I felt, his face etched with guilt. It felt. Any word from Adam? He asked softly. I shook my head, my throat too raw to speak. Ben ran a hand through his hair, letting out a heavy sigh. Lila, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I know, I whispered, though the words felt empty. But that doesn't change what we did. We fell into a tense silence, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I need to find him, I said, grabbing my phone and keys. Do you want me to come with you? Ben offered, but I shook my head. No, I said firmly. This is something I have to do alone. I drove aimlessly for hours, checking places I thought Adam might have gone. His office, the gym, even the small park where he used to go to clear his head. But he was nowhere to be found. Each failed attempt felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When I finally returned home, exhausted and defeated, I found him waiting on the porch. He sat on the steps, his shoulders hunched and his head in his hands. My heart twisted at the sight of him, but I forced myself to stay calm as I approached. Adam, I said tentatively, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with exhaustion. For a moment he just stared at me, as if trying to decide what to say. Finally he stood, shoving his hands into his pockets. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why, Lila, was I not enough for you? The question hit like a punch to the gut. It's not that, I said quickly. It's not about you not being enough. It's more complicated than that. Complicated? He repeated, his voice rising. You kissed my uncle, Lila. What's complicated about that? Tears spilled down my cheeks as I struggled to find the right words. I was lonely, I admitted finally. You've been so distant lately, Adam. It's like you're here, but you're not really here. I felt invisible. Adam stared at me, his expression a mixture of anger and hurt. And that justifies what you did? No, I said quickly, shaking my head. Nothing justifies it. I know I messed up. I know I betrayed you. But I never stopped loving you, Adam. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. You have a funny way of showing it. I took a step closer, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away. Please, Adam, I begged. Let's talk about this. Let me try to fix it. Fix it? He said, his voice dripping with disbelief. You think this is something you can fix? I have to try, I said, my voice trembling. Please, I'll do anything. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenching as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Finally, he spoke. I need time, Lila. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. My heart shattered at his words, but I nodded, knowing I had no right to ask for anything more. Take all the time you need, I said softly. I'll be here. The days that followed were agonizing. Adam stayed at a hotel, refusing to come home. He wouldn't answer my calls or respond to my texts, leaving me in a state of limbo. Ben tried to talk to me, to offer his support, but I couldn't bear to face him. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of what we'd done and how much we'd hurt Adam. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt, hoping it was Adam, but when I opened the door, I found his younger sister, Rachel, standing there. Her expression was unreadable as she stepped inside. I heard what happened, she said, crossing her arms. Adam told me. I felt a fresh wave of shame wash over me. Rachel, Save it, she interrupted. I didn't come here for your excuses. I swallowed hard, nodding. What do you want, then? To understand, she said, her tone sharp. Why? Why would you do this to him? To us? I don't know, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I wish I could take it back. I wish I could undo everything. Rachel shook her head, her expression softening slightly. You don't get to undo it, Lila. You have to live with it, and so does Adam. Her words were a harsh truth, but I knew she was right. There was no undoing what I'd done. The only thing I could do now was try to pick up the pieces. A week later, Adam finally called. His voice was cold and distant as he told me he wanted to meet at a neutral location to talk. I agreed, my heart pounding as I drove to the small cafe where we'd had our first date. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with his arms crossed. I hesitated before approaching, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Thanks for meeting me, I said as I sat down. He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. I've thought a lot about this, he said, about us. And I need to know, was it just a kiss? Or was there more? There wasn't more, I said quickly, my voice firm. I swear, Adam, it was just a kiss. It never went further than that. He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. I want to believe you, Lila, but how can I trust you after this? I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back, I said, my voice trembling. Just tell me what you need, and I'll do it. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw clenching as he fought to keep his emotions in check. I don't know if that's possible, he said finally, but I'm willing to try. For now. Relief washed over me, though I knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was determined to do whatever it took to make things right. The fragile truce between Adam and me didn't feel like a resolution, it felt like the calm before the storm. He moved back into the house, but our routines were cautious and mechanical. He barely spoke to me unless it was necessary, and the air between us was so thick with tension that even silence felt confrontational. Ben stayed out of sight for the most part. He'd begun spending most of his time in his room or out of the house entirely, leaving Adam and me alone to navigate the wreckage. It was better that way. Every time I caught a glimpse of him, a flood of shame and regret overwhelmed me. I avoided the parts of the house where he might be, determined to focus on repairing the mess I had made. But the inevitable confrontation finally came late one evening. It was raining hard, the rhythmic pounding against the windows adding an almost cinematic weight to the moment. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, the clatter of dishes masking the approaching footsteps. When I turned, Adam was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay." He walked over to the dining table and sat down, gesturing for me to join him. I hesitated before sitting across from him, wiping my damp hands on a towel to stall for time. His eyes locked onto mine, searching, accusing, and somehow still hopeful all at once. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head quickly. "It wasn't like that. It was just that one moment, Adam, I swear. It didn't go any further." His jaw tightened and he leaned forward. "But it could have, couldn't it?" I froze, the truth hanging heavily between us. He already knew the answer. There was no point in lying. "Maybe," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But it didn't." I stopped it. "Why?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Why did you stop? Because you felt guilty? Or because you were afraid I'd find out?" "Because it wasn't right," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "Because I knew I didn't want to lose you." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Funny way of showing it, Lila. You didn't want to lose me, but you kissed my uncle in our kitchen." "It wasn't planned," I said, my voice breaking. "It just happened. I was lonely, Adam. I felt like you didn't see me anymore. Like I didn't matter to you." His eyes widened, and for a moment I saw the hurt beneath the anger. "And you thought Ben would make you feel seen?" "It wasn't about Ben," I said quickly. "It could have been anyone, honestly. I needed to feel like I was still important to someone." Adam sat back in his chair, his expression hardening again. "So now it's my fault? Is that what you're saying?" "No," I said, shaking my head vehemently. "It's not your fault. I'm not blaming you. I'm trying to explain how I got to that moment. I'm trying to make you understand." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the table. The sound of rain filled the room, a relentless backdrop to our unraveling. Finally, he looked up. "What about him?" he asked. "What does Ben mean to you?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "It wasn't about him. It was a mistake, Adam. That's all it was." He nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can believe that." "Please," I whispered, reaching across the table for his hand. "I love you, Adam. I never stopped loving you. I want to fix this. I want to make things right." He didn't pull away, but he didn't reciprocate the gesture either. He stared at our hands, his expression pained. "How do I know you won't do it again?" "Because I won't," I said, my voice firm. "Because I've learned from this. I know how much I've hurt you, and I would never risk losing you again." He didn't respond, his silence stretching painfully between us. Finally he stood, pulling his hand away. "I need some time," he said, his voice hollow. "I need to figure out if I can trust you again." "Take all the time you need," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'll wait as long as it takes." He nodded, turning to leave, but before he reached the doorway, he paused. "You need to tell Ben to leave," he said without looking back. "I can't be in this house with him." I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "Okay," I said softly. "I'll tell him." Later that night, I knocked on Ben's door. He opened it cautiously, his expression wary. "Lila," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "We need to talk," I said, echoing Adam's words from earlier. My voice was firmer than I expected, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Ben nodded, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I figured this was coming." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "You need to leave." He looked surprised, though not entirely shocked. "Did Adam ask you to say that?" "He did," I admitted. "But it's not just about him. I need space too, Ben. I need space too, Ben. I need to figure out how to fix my marriage, and I can't do that with you here." Ben nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I understand," he said. "I'll pack my things." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As I left his room, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that a piece of the puzzle was being removed, but sorrow for what had been lost in the process. There was no undoing the damage, no erasing the mistakes. All I could do now was hope that Adam and I could find a way to rebuild from the ruins. Ben moved out the next morning. He didn't make a scene or even say much beyond the basics. I watched from the window as he loaded his small suitcase into his car. He paused once, glancing back at the house with an expression that was difficult to read. Regret, perhaps? Or maybe relief? Then he got into the car and drove away, leaving behind an emptiness that was both physical and emotional. The silence in the house afterward was deafening. Without Ben's presence to fill the spaces that Adam had left vacant, the walls seemed to close in on me. Adam stayed distant, avoiding unnecessary conversations and leaving for work earlier than usual. I, in turn, busied myself with anything I could: cleaning, work, cooking meals that went uneaten. One evening, as I scrubbed the kitchen counters for the second time that day, Adam came home. He didn't announce himself as he usually did. I only noticed when I heard his keys hit the bowl by the door. My stomach tightened as he stepped into the kitchen, his expression guarded. "We need to talk," he said. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd been expecting them. I nodded, drying my hands on a towel and motioning toward the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling like a chasm. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" I asked hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, his eyes focused on a spot on the carpet. "I've been thinking about everything," he said. "About us, about what happened, and about whether this can work." I braced myself, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. "And?" Adam finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I'm angry, Lila. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry. What you did, what he did, it shattered something in me, something I don't know if I can ever put back together." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I know," I said. "And I'm so sorry, Adam. I hate myself for hurting you. If I could take it back, I would." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I believe you. But I also need to be honest with you. Part of me wants to leave. Part of me thinks that's the only way I can move past this." The words struck me like a dagger, and I struggled to keep my composure. "I understand," I whispered. "But I don't want you to go. I want to fight for us. I want to fix what I broke." Adam leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside had started again, the soft patter against the windows the only sound in the room. "I don't know if it's possible to fix this," he said finally. "But I think I owe it to us to try. We've been through too much together to throw it all away without at least trying." Relief flooded through me. but it was tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. This wasn't a victory. It was a challenge, a mountain we'd have to climb together, and I wasn't sure if we'd make it to the other side. Over the following weeks, Adam and I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. We went to couples counseling where we aired out our grievances and learned how to communicate in ways we hadn't before. I confessed to the loneliness I'd felt in our marriage, and Adam admitted to taking me for granted. It wasn't easy. Some sessions ended with raised voices and slammed doors, but others left us feeling like we'd made progress, however small. Ben became a topic we couldn't avoid, though neither of us wanted to dwell on it. Adam hated him, and while I understood his anger, I also felt a lingering sadness for the relationship I'd destroyed, not just between Adam and me, but between him and his uncle as well. One evening, after a particularly intense counseling session, Adam and I sat on the porch together, watching the sun set. It was the first time in weeks that we'd been able to share a moment of quiet without the weight of our problems pressing down on us. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Adam was silent for a moment before turning to look at me. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to believe we can be. That's why I'm still here." I reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. Time moved slowly, but eventually the wounds began to heal. Adam started to laugh again, though it was rare and fleeting. I learned to be patient, to give him the space he needed, while still showing him that I was committed to earning back his trust. One day, as we sat together in the living room, Adam turned to me, his expression softer than I'd seen in months. "You know," he said, "I never thought we'd get to this point." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice trembling, "but I'm so glad we did." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Me too." It wasn't a grand declaration of forgiveness, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The storm that had once consumed my life began to settle, leaving behind a quiet calm. It wasn't the same as before. It couldn't be. But in its place was something new, a tentative sense of hope. Adam and I were still rebuilding brick by fragile brick, but the foundation of our marriage felt sturdier than it had in years. It was a start. The hardest part of healing wasn't the counseling sessions or the conversations that left us both raw and vulnerable. It was facing myself. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the cracks in my reflection, a constant reminder of the betrayal I had inflicted. I couldn't avoid the questions that haunted me late at night. How had I let it get to this point? Why had I allowed myself to cross that line? The truth was layered, complicated, and deeply uncomfortable. I had spent so much time blaming Adam for the emotional distance in our marriage that I'd ignored my own role in it. Yes, he had been preoccupied with work, but I had been just as guilty of retreating into myself. I had let resentment fester, allowing it to twist into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. And then there was Ben. Thinking about him was like pressing on a bruise, painful but impossible to resist. I had told myself that his attention filled a void, that he had simply been there at the wrong time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something undeniable about the connection we'd shared, something that scared me as much as it intrigued me. But that part of my life was over. Ben had been the match, but I had been the one who struck it. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could choose how I moved forward. I had to let go of him and the what-ifs that came with his memory. Dwelling on it would only pull me further away from the life I was trying to rebuild with Adam. One evening, I found myself standing in the garden, the cool breeze brushing against my skin. It was a place I had avoided for months, a place that reminded me too much of the conversations Ben and I had shared there, the quiet moments that had felt so harmless at the time. But now, as I stood there alone, I realized how much I had been running from the past instead of confronting it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the scents of lavender and jasmine fill my senses. I thought about the woman I had been when I first moved into this house, the woman who felt invisible, unimportant, and unloved. I wasn't that woman anymore. The events of the past months had forced me to confront my deepest fears and insecurities, to acknowledge the parts of myself I had tried to bury. I opened my eyes, staring up at the darkening sky. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. I couldn't change the mistakes I had made, but I could choose to grow from them. I could choose to be better, not just for Adam, but for myself. The next morning, Adam and I sat together at the breakfast table, a quiet but significant routine we had started to rebuild. He was reading the paper, his coffee steaming beside him, while I scrolled through my phone. The silence between us was no longer tense, it was comfortable, like slipping into an old, familiar sweater. "I was thinking," Adam said suddenly, setting down his paper, "maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us." I looked up, surprised. "A trip?" He nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Yeah, I think we could both use a change of scenery. Maybe someplace quiet where we can just be." The idea warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. "I'd like that," I said softly. "I think it's a great idea." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. It was the first time he had touched me in such an intimate way since everything had happened. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked back tears. "We are getting there, Lila," he said, his voice steady. "It's going to take time, but we're getting there." I nodded, squeezing his hand. "I know, and I'm not going anywhere." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how far we had come. Our marriage wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was stronger than it had been in a long time. We had learned how to talk to each other again, how to listen, and how to meet each other halfway. For the first time in years, I felt like we were truly partners, navigating the challenges of life together. And this time, the journey wasn't over. There would be more hard days, more moments of doubt and frustration, but there would also be laughter, connection, and love. I had learned that marriage wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing each other, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the lessons I had learned through it all. I thought about the importance of communication, of vulnerability, and of never taking the people you love for granted. And most of all, I thought about the strength it took to face your mistakes, to own them, and to move forward. In the quiet darkness of our bedroom, with Adam's steady breathing beside me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Months passed and the seasons began to change. The crisp autumn air brought a sense of renewal, as if nature itself was reminding me that nothing stays the same forever, that even the darkest winters eventually give way to spring. Life with Adam had become steadier, our once shaky foundation now bolstered by months of hard conversations, shared moments, and the quiet decision to keep choosing each other every day. The trip Adam had suggested became a reality. We booked a cabin in the mountains, far from the noise and distractions of the city. It was a modest place, tucked away in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines and the soft whispers of a nearby stream. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect, an escape that allowed us to focus on us. The first few days were tentative. We spent most of the time hiking, reading, and cooking simple meals together. Slowly, the tension that had lingered between us began to melt away. Laughter returned, first in small bursts, then in full, hearty waves that echoed through the cabin. We began to feel like ourselves again, or perhaps like a new version of ourselves, shaped by the storm we'd weathered. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Adam and I sat on the cabin's porch with steaming mugs of tea. The silence between us was peaceful, the kind that comes from being completely comfortable in someone's presence. "I've been thinking," Adam said, his voice breaking the quiet. "About what?" I asked, glancing at him. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "About everything, about what happened and where we are now." I tensed slightly, but his tone wasn't accusatory. It was reflective, thoughtful. "I realized something," he continued. "What happened between you and Ben, it hurt me in ways I didn't think were possible. But it also forced me to take a hard look at myself, at how I'd let my work consume me, how I stopped being present in our marriage." "Adam," I began, but he shook his head gently. "Let me finish," he said. "I'm not excusing what you did, Lila. But I see now that it wasn't just about you or Ben. It was about us, about the distance we'd let grow between us. And I'm glad we've found our way back." Tears welled up in my eyes as I set my mug down and reached for his hand. "I'm glad too," I said, my voice trembling. "I never stopped loving you, Adam. Even when I felt lost, even when I made mistakes, you were always the one I wanted." He looked at me then, his expression soft and open in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "I love you too, Lila, and I think we're going to be okay." Hearing those words felt like a balm to my soul, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still there. I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder as we watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Back home, life returned to its steady rhythm. Adam and I found a new normal, one that included more date night, more time spent talking, and fewer distractions. We weren't perfect, no one was, but we were stronger for what we'd been through. Ben, on the other hand, remained a ghost in our lives. Adam had cut ties with him completely, refusing to speak his name or entertain the idea of reconciliation. I respected his decision, though a part of me felt a lingering sadness for what had been lost. Ben had been a fixture in Adam's life for years, and his absence left a noticeable void. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old photo albums, I came across a picture of the three of us at a family barbecue years ago. Adam and Ben were laughing, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, while I stood off to the side, smiling at the camera. The image felt like a snapshot from another life, a life that had been irreparably altered. I tucked the photo back into the album and closed it, taking a deep breath. I couldn't change the past, but I could honor the lessons it had taught me. I could choose to focus on the present, on the love and connection I had with Adam, and on the future we were building together. We had come so far. There were days when the weight of what had happened still lingered, but those days were becoming fewer and farther between. We were healing together. After the last guest had left and the house was quiet again, Adam pulled me into his arms in the middle of the living room. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands gently cradling my waist. "You know," he said softly, I didn't think we'd ever get here, but I'm glad we did. Me too, I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. He kissed me then, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of love, and of the promise of better days ahead. In that moment, I knew we were going to be okay, not because we were perfect, but because we had chosen to fight for each other, to rebuild what had been broken. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I realized that life isn't about avoiding mistakes or failures. It's about what you do afterward, how you pick yourself up, how you make amends, and how you choose to move forward. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole, and for that, I was grateful. It had been nearly a year since the kiss that fractured our world and the slow, deliberate effort to piece it back together. Adam and I had settled into a rhythm, imperfect but steady, with moments of tenderness that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they felt softer now, less like jagged wounds and more like faint scars. One crisp autumn afternoon, Adam suggested we visit a nearby winery for the weekend. It was an idea that seemed out of character for him, but it spoke to the changes in our relationship. He was trying, just as I was, to create moments for us to reconnect and build something stronger than before. The winery was tucked into rolling hills, the vines stretched out like an endless quilt of greens and golds. We sat on the patio, sipping wine and sharing a charcuterie board, while the setting sun bathed the landscape in amber light. For the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed freely, the weight of our past seeming far behind us. As the evening wore on, we wandered the vineyard, hand in hand, the cool air wrapping around us like a gentle embrace. The world felt quiet, still, and intimate. "Lila," Adam said softly, stopping beneath the canopy of an old oak tree. His tone carried a gravity that made me pause. "What is it?" I asked, searching his face. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, a habit he had whenever he was trying to find the right words. "There's something I need to tell you." My stomach twisted. His tone, the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, it all felt too familiar, too much like the start of a confession. "What is it?" I repeated, my voice quieter this time. He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. "That night, the night I walked in on you and Ben. When I left the house, I didn't just drive around. I went to a bar." I stiffened, the memory of that night rushing back like a flood. "Okay?" I said slowly, unsure where this was going. "I was angry, hurt, and I wasn't thinking straight," he continued, his voice tight. "I ran into someone there, a woman." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I didn't ask him to continue, but he did anyway, the silence between us demanding it. We talked. I told her everything, about us, about what had happened. She was sympathetic, and I guess I needed that in the moment, someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for feeling how I did. "What happened, Adam?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me then, his eyes full of regret. "I kissed her, just once, and then I left. But it was enough to make me realize that I didn't want anyone else, that no matter how angry I was, no matter how hurt, I still wanted you." I stared at him, the weight of his confession pressing down on me. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand how he could judge me so harshly when he'd crossed a line himself. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last year working toward forgiveness, understood. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I asked. "Because I was ashamed," he admitted, "and because I didn't want to add to your guilt. I wanted us to focus on moving forward, not on what I'd done." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't just tears of anger or hurt. They were tears of relief, of understanding, of something unspoken finally being brought to light. Adam, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly, reaching for my hands. I just needed you to know. I didn't want this between us anymore. I nodded, squeezing his hands tightly. Thank you for telling me, I said, my voice trembling. I'm not going to lie, it hurts. But I get it. I do. He pulled me into his arms, holding me close as the sun dipped below the horizon. I love you, Lila, he whispered, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know that. I love you too, I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. We're stronger than this, Adam. I know we are. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I realized something profound. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to let go of the weight of the past so you can move forward. Adam and I weren't perfect. We had both made mistakes, and we had both hurt each other in ways we couldn't take back. But we were choosing each other anyway. And that choice, I realized, was the strongest thing of all. The twist in Adam's confession left a ripple in the quiet waters we'd worked so hard to calm. But rather than tearing us apart, it brought us closer. The vulnerability he showed in sharing his own mistakes allowed me to fully forgive myself for mine. It wasn't about balancing the scales. It was about realizing that we were human, flawed, and capable of both hurting and healing. Life went on. We continued our counseling sessions, continued to work on being better partners to each other. And slowly the scars of the past began to fade. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched the sunrise through the kitchen window, Adam walked in, his hair mussed from sleep. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I smiled, leaning into his warmth. "About how far we've come," I said, "and how grateful I am that we didn't give up." He kissed my temple, his lips lingering for a moment. "Me too," he said. "We're a hell of a team, aren't we?" I nodded, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "We are." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the kitchen in golden light, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the fleeting kind, but the deep, enduring peace that comes from knowing you've faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. Our story wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was ours, and that I realized was enough.